Hi, my name is Davnak, and today we're going to talk about how to make an album or project on the OPZ. This is going to be a two-part series. In the first part, we're going to be talking about arranging and mixing on the OPZ itself. The goal of that being able to take a basic track or song idea, or maybe a fully fleshed out idea on the OPZ, and get it in a very polished and finalized state within the unit. Then the second part, we're going to be talking about various ways that we can then take that track outside of the OPZ into a DAW and really polish and finish it up at what I would consider the last 20 or 10% to get it ready for an official release. So without further ado, let's get started. So to start out, I want to talk about arranging in the OPZ. There's a lot of different tools that we have available to us to make sure that you have some sort of set song structure, but not nothing so limiting that you don't have any kind of improvisation. I think the OPZ really shines when it comes to live performances, but definitely make sure that you're making use of both the patterns and the mute groups. When I first got started, it was tempting to just use patterns, and if I had a section here where I have everything except the lead line, and then I want to bring the lead line in, I might be tempted to use two patterns, but I find it a lot easier and more efficient to have it all in one pattern, and I use mute groups to take elements in and out because it makes it more performative, and it also makes it easier, especially if I'm performing live, where I can see, if I go to my mixer, I can see what is active, what isn't, instead of having to try to look at each individual track and figure out what is in what. The next thing I would advise, and probably most importantly, is make sure you're using step components and LFOs for variations in your tracks. In a very basic sense, a step sequencer just has a set length. You put some notes in it, and it loops those notes. Now, sometimes when working with step sequencers, it can be really easy to get stale loops. However, if you have a guy with a guitar on a stage playing 4 chords for 10 minutes, it's never going to sound exactly the same. But every time he plays those 4 chords, it's going to be slightly different because of human imperfection. And we kind of like that. Now, sometimes you may want it to sound super similar and not be crazy wild, but it's still good to have some level of variation. And that's where the LFOs and step components really come into play. And so here's an example. This is my track off my new EP, Breath, called Convolution. And I'm gonna solo the chord track. I'm actually not using any step components here because I wanted it to have some level of consistency because this is the main harmony for the entire track. But I didn't want it to end up being pale. I'm using the organ engine, and I'm using this LFO that's modulating the first parameter of the organ engine, which I believe is cycling through different engines within the organ engine. Kind of weird how it's set up, but ends up kind of also changing the octave of it. So take a listen to this line. So you see, between using the LFO to modulate the first parameter and then also the conjunction of I have a delay and a reverb being sent to this, it really has this evolving sound that's changing and kind of random, and it's not just this dull pad that just sits and just adds fluff to a mix. And you don't have to do something as extreme as a random LFO. It can be something more subtle, or it can be even way more extreme than this. Another example is in this arpeggio track for this section. I'm using this not as a raw straight arpeggio, but I have a lot of step components on this. And one of my favorite ones to use is to ignore the trigger every certain number of hits. And this allows me to take, again, a 4-bar loop, a 2-bar loop, and turn it into a 16-bar phrase, because not every trigger is being hit every time that the playback hits that trigger. I can have it set to random, I can have it set to every due fourth. Really use this to your advantage, because I have this track set to a single bar. So if I hit play, So there's a lot of like random ear candy type stuff happening in what is essentially a 1-bar loop. And on top of that, I'm also using I forget the name of it, the duplicate. Basically, whenever this trigger hits, it plays the arpeggio twice as fast. But then you also notice I have a trigger that's saying, hey, only play it twice as fast for the first 4 times and then stop on the 5th. But then I'm also telling it only to play the actual trigger every 3 times and then don't play it on the 4th time. So you almost get this, it's not really polyrhythmic, but like the relationship between when it plays that trigger double time, when it doesn't play that trigger, and when it plays it just regularly is almost polyrhythmic in that it's not always landing on the same times every single time. And that really adds a little bit more of interest. So if I play these two together, you get this really kind of vast sandscape that is always changing. And even in my lead line, I'm using the LFO at a super slow rate so that the lead line has this kind of element of constantly changing. Even though it's only just one LFO, it really can add a lot to your patterns and make them a lot more interesting. So if you have a track and you're not using the LFO on it, or you're not using step components, definitely make sure you use that a lot. And my second point is leave room for improvisation. Don't always like have your tracks be so rigid that like you basically just hit play and listen to it and do nothing. Especially if you're wanting to be able to play these live. In this track, I'm only using 4 patterns, and this is actually kind of big for me because like a lot of my this album I use more, but this whole song is 3 patterns. This one is 2, this one is 2, and this track is actually a 6-minute track. It's the last track on the album, which ended up being really long. But I only used 4 patterns and got a lot of my variation in different sections by using mute groups in each pattern. So each pattern kind of becomes almost like a intro, verse, chorus, bridge, and then I hop between them. And this allows me to perform it live, add all sorts of variation, and then I'm able to add that human element of imperfection where like I'm not playing the song exactly the same as it is on the record. It's a little bit different, but it also makes it a lot more interesting. So moving on, let's talk about mixing on the OPZ. I think that when I approach a project on the OPZ, I want to make sure the mix is as good as it can be before I decide to start recording it out. But I really want to drive home the point that try to get the mix as good as it can be within the OBZ, and you actually have a lot of really good tools available to you, even though it may seem limiting at first. And the first thing that I'm going to suggest is to mix with your arrangement. When you're arranging your track, a lot of the mix problems that you might encounter can be solved through mixing. So let's take a look at this track. So there's kind of a lot going on in this piece, and which is, even though there's only 8 tracks, you can still get these very lush soundscapes out of OPZ, and a lot of that is helped by the fact that they added the new reverb, which is just, it's gorgeous. But when you're arranging your track, you want to make sure that you're spreading your different parts out. And what I mean by that is it can be very easy that, let's take this for example. If I go, so here, what I've done is, if I listen to this arpeggio line, I brought it down a couple octaves. It sounds really cool. I kind of like it like that. And I also brought the chord down an octave. Has a much more darker tone. And honestly, this darker tone I think would fit the vibe of the song that I was going for. But watch what happens when I add everything in at once. I kind of lose the upper shimmer that I had before, and I'm starting to get some muddiness in the low mids, and I think that's something that I constantly am running into when I'm mixing on the OPZ, is constantly getting these muddy sounds, because you know, when I'm writing a chord part, like I love that sounds really cool, but in the context of the mix, it's just muddy. So in this, I can bring the chord up an octave, and I can bring the arpeggios up an octave, and then I'm using the filter to tame the arpeggios, because if I don't have the filter on, the filter is kind of too in your face, it's too bright, it doesn't really fit the track, so I'm using the filter to tame off some of the high end, but I shifted it up a couple octaves, that way it's not interfering with the bass and the kick. Same thing with the chord, it's really easy for my chord tracks to end up being muddy, because I have the kick drum in the low frequencies, I have the bass drum in the low frequencies and low mids, and then if I also have like a chord track and the arpeggio all playing down there, it just gets super muddy. You know, as a keyboardist, it's really common for keyboardists to play, you know, the triad in the top, and then maybe play the bass line doubled an octave below. And that sounds really cool. You know, for example, if I play a C minor or F minor chord, that sounds really cool. But I'd already have the bass line playing that low octave, so I don't need this note. I can just play the triad at the top, maybe even free up the polyphony to make it a 7 chord or something like that. And honestly, because in this track I can use the filters, I could play it an octave higher. If I want to make it darker, use the filter to make it darker. So really, when you're getting in the mixing phase and you're noticing like your tracks are getting muddy, play around with shifting the octaves and voicing of some of your chords. But spreading your voices out and kind of allocating space, you know, leave the bass track to handle most of the lows and low mid stuff, and use the chord track maybe to do some high end stuff or high mids or what have you, and make sure you don't have too many tracks overlapping in the same octave range, because this is what you'll end up getting something called frequency masking. And when you have too many things occupying the same space in the frequency spectrum, they end up kind of canceling each other out, getting muddy, and it just doesn't sound good. Now let's say if you really want, you don't want to compromise on the arrangement. You really want that chord track to be kind of in that lower register, or you want that arpeggio to be really low. You know, what you can do is the filters are going to be your best friend when it comes to mixing. I know the first thing we think of, like, oh, if I'm trying to mix a track in the OPZ, the only option I really have is the level control. But your filters are actually going to be your biggest friend, especially since the OPZ doesn't have an EQ, but the filter really can be your EQ. You should be using all the filters on the OPZ, every single one. And here's why. In this example, when I was playing the chord track here, there's still kind of a lot of a low end that I definitely don't really need. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to high pass the chord track and cut a lot of that out. So let's do that. See, that might be too much because now I'm kind of losing the entire sound. So I'll go back a little bit. And then I do want some mids, so I might bring the resonance up. So now I'm still getting that kind of shimmery from the top, I'm still getting some body from the chord, but it's not going to intrude. With the bass line. So make sure you're using all of your filters, and if you look at all my tracks, I'm using them in every single one. The lead line, I'm filtering off some of the high end because it's so high, but in the example of this kind of like rain sample, if I take out the filter, There's a lot of mid frequencies in there, a lot of mud that I don't necessarily need that in the mix. I already have the chords filling out the body of the track. I just wanted this for like a kind of almost a rain type sound. So can filter it all out till I'm just getting some of the high end and then adding a little bit of resonance to boost the upper mids and to be able to get that to shimmer out really nicely. So make use of your filters. Be careful about low end and mud. And another thing that I've done, I don't know if I did it on this track. Yeah, I did. Is I used a filter on the effect track too. This is really big, especially with clearing up mud. Like this reverb, I'm sending a lot of stuff to it. And so I don't want the reverb to add to the issue. So I'm just filtering out some of the low end because like you don't need reverb on your sub frequencies. So in a lot of my tracks, I'll end up filtering out, sometimes 55 up to 60 or, use your ears on this and to help clean up what's being sent to the reverb track. So those are just some tips that I have learned when working with the OPZ and arranging and getting it ready for a mixing phase. I know there are a lot more tips. I could have done a lot more detail about specifics and step components. That's not really the purpose of this video. The main purpose of this video was just get an introduction for some mixing techniques and what I have found helpful when doing this kind of stuff. In the next video, we're going to be going into detail on how I took this song, recorded it into Ableton, and then what I did after that to be able to get it polished before I sent it off to Spotify. So I'll have a link below for the next video. That should be coming out soon, and thank you for coming.